Hello, everyone. My apologies for the slight delay, but now that we're all here, let's get started. Before we get onto the session itself, could you please type in yes or no if you can see my screen, and also if you can hear me clearly? Yes, thank you. Thank you for those responses. Thanks, everyone. So welcome to our webinar on learning-oriented assessment. This webinar was designed especially for those who are thinking of applying to our action research program this year. As you may know, the theme for this year is learning-oriented assessment and technology. And our presenter today, all the way from Cambridge, how exciting, is Fiona Barker, who is Principal Manager of the Research and Validation Group at Cambridge English Language Assessment. Now, some of you may know that Fiona is also part of the Action Research Reference Group, and the best person to explain what learning-oriented approach is and its implications for teaching, learning, and assessment. So Fiona, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Aparna, and welcome everyone this evening. Evening for you, morning for me. It's great to be here. So I'm just waiting for my first slide to pop up. There we go. So this session will discuss ways in which ELT practitioners, so we're thinking mainly about teachers, but also about academic managers and others. We're thinking about how these ELT practitioners can develop a more learning-oriented approach to teaching and assessment. And you might like to use this as preparation for putting together a proposal for an action research project in this year's scheme or in future years of the scheme. So what we'll do today, we will firstly think about different aspects of assessment. We'll revisit the current views of assessment, and we'll be answering the question, what is assessment? In the second section, we'll look at an integrated approach to teaching, learning, and assessment, and we'll be answering the question, what exactly is learning-oriented assessment, or LOA for short. And finally, we'll review a case study from the ELICOS context, so you can think about, well, how can I put LOA into practice? I hope that's what you're expecting, and I think it's going to be a really interesting session. So first of all, if I was to ask you the question, what is assessment? You'd come up with lots of different terms and labels. And assessment is a concept and a term we're all familiar with. We've been assessed many times ourselves, and we assess others through our roles as teachers or academic managers. So we're going to look at these two approaches that I've put up, summative assessment and formative assessment. And there are lots of aspects of these types of assessment, and they can be viewed as in opposition to each other. And these terms are widely known, but we'll look at both in a little bit more detail. So we'll first of all consider formative assessment and all the things that come within that, and then we'll look at summative assessment. And as you see, that little image at the bottom shows that we're thinking about, they're sort of currently thought of as dichotomies or in opposition to each other. So first of all, we'll think about aspects of formative assessment. And it's all about, it obviously links to what happens in the classroom. It's known as assessment for learning. And it typically is to do with ongoing assessment during a period of study, whether that's 2 weeks or a term or a year. And formative assessment responds to the evolving needs of learners, and it emphasizes interaction, support, development, scaffolding, so it's quite a nurturing form of assessment. But it's often based on the teacher's intuition, and it can be seen to be lacking reliability and validity if you think about all the different types of assessment there are out there. And maybe after this webinar or as you're listening to me here today, you might like to think of other aspects of formative assessment from your own experience. So let's have a look now at summative assessment. And this is seen as more standardized assessment, often known as assessment of learning. And it involves tests at the end of a period of study rather than throughout a period of study. Summative assessment is linked to a syllabus or a theoretical model, perhaps. And summative assessment is designed with validity and reliability in mind. It's designed to assess exactly what it's there to assess, and it's designed to assess whatever you're testing accurately and reliably. So if the test is taken on several occasions, you'll come up with a very similar result. I won't say exactly the same because there are many other learner variables and contextual variables that affect performance on any assessment. But there are some cons, some disadvantages to summative assessment. It's often perceived as just grading or giving a score or a grade to students. And of course it could involve teaching to the test, whereby we're teaching test wiseness techniques rather than language proficiency. So again, you can see how formative and summative assessment are in opposition to each other in various ways. So if we think about these two forms of assessment, they're very traditional terms, they're familiar to teachers, and they are useful. They're helpful for our teachers and for our students perhaps to know what our learners are doing, when they're doing it, and why they're doing it. So they do help us as teachers. But these distinctions are perhaps a false dichotomy, and the question for us to think about is, are they still useful in today's world? We're not going to have that discussion now, but that's something you can go away and think about after the webinar. So perhaps just having formative and summative assessment, it's an oversimplification of these concepts, because we have this tendency to see them as separate. But there's maybe a blurring of boundaries between these two terms, because we can use summative assessment formatively and formative assessment summatively. I'll give you an example because sometimes it's difficult to get your head around these sorts of abstract statements. So if we think about a progress test, for example, we find ourselves saying that we're using a summative assessment formatively because we're getting a snapshot of where the learner is and we're using that to inform their future learning. So based on that, sorry, I'm just putting up the next slide. So thinking about these two different concepts, I think we're restricting our thinking by locating types of assessment either as formative or summative. But if we do that, we're saying that we can compare them. But I would argue that actually they're not opposing ideas at all. Instead, they sit on a spectrum or on a continuum. So this means that we can't really compare them because they're not polar opposites. They're really two sides of the same coin. So the problem is we have these quite imprecise terms and our whole discussion about assessment becomes a little bit confusing. So if you can picture a continuum, on one side we have formative assessment, typically based in the classroom. This could be a real classroom or a virtual classroom, of course. And on the other side we have summative, large-scale assessment. And we have this sort of traditional distinction to account for different purposes of assessment. Why are we assessing people? And formative assessment, the purpose of that is to guide what happens next. It's all about development, it's forward-looking. Whereas on the other, towards the other end of the continuum, we have summative, large-scale assessment, which is about evaluating what has happened in the student's learning to date. So you're making a judgment, and it's it's backward looking, it's seeing where the student is. And one purpose supports another. And this is where we see there's actually a link between them rather than them being opposites. So, just waiting for the slide. So, what you're actually doing with assessment, with both types of assessment, you're providing evidence about student learning so that you can feed back to the students, so it supports their learning in a more of a feed-forward way. And this is what learning-oriented assessment is all about. It's about using different forms of assessment to provide evidence, to feed forward, to support the student's learning. So that is a general introduction to assessment, thinking about summative assessment and formative assessment, and putting them into a continuum with the sole purpose of assessment being to support learning, and this is what learning-oriented assessment is actually about. So let's move on to the second section, and this is looking in more detail about what LOA actually is. And there's quite a useful quote here, because LOA captures the centrality of learning within assessment, because, as David Carlis says in 2009, for all assessments, whether they're predominantly summative or formative, their key aim is to promote productive student learning. And I'm sure we'd all agree with that statement. So looking in a bit more detail at some aspects of LOA, it focuses on increasing the learning of our students. It's integrated with language learning activities presented in the classroom. It's not seen as an add-on at the end of the course or at certain points in a course. LOA is designed to feed forward, to assist future learning. So it's not just feedback, but it's giving concrete, usable feedback to students that actually moves them on in their learning. LOA is based on teachers' decisions about what they observe in their students' learning. And it's interesting, and we'll look at this later, but the observations may be the teacher's own observations, or it may be peer observation as well, or observation of other teachers. And LOA is also integrated with new ways of recording the progress that learners are making. And that's where technology comes in. And we'll revisit that a little bit later. So I hope that gives you a picture of LOA, but we'll look at a few more aspects of LOA. So LOA is about setting clear learner objectives. It's about tracking their progress towards achieving objectives. It's about assessing both with tests and in the classroom, whether it's virtual or real, as we've said before. And it's also using these insights to feed into the teaching cycle. It's not seeing assessment as something separate. It's seeing assessment as part and parcel of the learning and teaching that goes on every day in your classrooms. So of course you might be sitting there thinking, well, teachers do that. A good teacher should do that all the time. And of course that's true. And great teachers, experienced teachers, they should do this intuitively anyway. But what LOA gives us is a systematic framework to do this in. And an LOA framework, and I'll show you a model in a few slides' time, it's all about using digital systems or maybe LOA materials such as specific courses that are developed in this way to help teachers make their intuitions concrete, really. LOA, I think, pulls all these ideas together and makes it accessible to all teachers. There's quite a nice quote here from Bood from 2000. Assessment has to serve double duty. Assessment is doing two things. And Bood talks of this double duty of assessment because assessment is about grading people just as much as it's about assessing the learning of people. And assessment is also about standardization as well as individualization. So it's about getting it at the standard of a group as well as being personalizable to individual students. But an interesting point about assessment is it has to be principled and practical to implement, otherwise there's too much to do and it becomes very messy. And I'm sure you'd all agree that learning surely lies at the heart of assessment. And that's why I think, because of the difficulties that there have been over the last 30 years or so, and of course before then, there was quite a lot of confusion and terminology around assessment, and LOA is a new term that has emerged to describe basically the integration of learning, teaching and assessment, and to give you as teachers a standardized framework to use. I have a diagram coming up which hopefully will be helpful to show the key features of LOA. And we have a nice learning-oriented assessment triangle here. And first of all, we have learning tasks that the students are doing. And we have the feedback that is given to the students based on their performance in the tasks. And of course, we have learner involvement. And this is learner involvement in doing the tasks, learner involvement in assessing themselves and assessing others perhaps, but maybe learner autonomy as well in self-regulating their own learning, in selecting what they want to do next, and in having more input into the course than maybe has happened in the past. I'll look at each of these in a little more detail. So in terms of the learning activities that students should be doing in an LOA model, obviously they're aligned with curriculum or syllabus objectives, and maybe with current theories as well. They're authentic tasks as far as they can be, so they have some resonance in the real world. We're not asking students to do things that they would never need to do out there in the real world. Also, learning tasks can motivate students if the content is appropriate and they're given a degree of choice, and of course that is up to you, and each individual cohort of students will have different needs on this point, and we all know some groups of students do not want to sort of make choices themselves, whereas others will absolutely love doing that. I think part of that is knowing your students, and if you know them well enough, they can help you choose the best tasks and the best activities and the best forms of assessment for them. Let's think a little bit now about how learners can be involved, and I've mentioned some of these already. Obviously, learners can be involved with maybe setting criteria, maybe setting standards, providing exemplars. I don't know if you do this, but it might be something you can do with a more advanced class, can come in and do some work with a less advanced class, perhaps, or provide some exemplars for less proficient students to work towards. Obviously, students can be involved in assessing their own performance or peers' performance, and they can provide feedback as well. But on feedback, there are different types. Obviously, peer feedback and peer assessment. We all know that sometimes the same message delivered by a classmate as opposed to the teacher has a stronger impact. And also perhaps students, some students anyway, are incredibly honest with their peers, so they will give the feedback that maybe as a teacher you might feel unable to give. But also feedback in LOA, it should be timely and it should be forward-looking, so it should always have a developmental purpose. And I think timely is a really key word. It's not about making observations and then giving feedback to your students at the end of the week or at the end of the semester, at the end of the year. It's about giving feedback as quickly as possible. And obviously that's relevant in your particular context. So there are some key features of LOA, and I think if you keep that triangle in mind, or pyramid, if you wish, that will help you throughout the rest of the webinar and thinking about LOA in your own teaching. There are a couple more important points about LOA that we'll now look at before I give you a picture of how you can put LOA into practice. So first of all, part of learning-oriented assessment is about collecting evidence of learning. And as a teacher, you need to think about what is relevant as evidence of learning, how would you collect it, and how would you keep records of it, and how do you align it with course objectives, and how do you align it with external exams. If we were workshopping this, we'd talk through all these ideas and share all of your own experiences of collecting evidence and record keeping. But that's something you can do maybe with your colleagues or maybe this evening once you get home. The main points about collecting evidence for LOA is it's got to be quantifiable and measurable. You've got to be able to measure what you're collecting. Obviously, there are many different ways of measuring evidence, whether it's giving a giving a grade, giving a score, giving a comment, and other ways as well. But you need to be able to measure the level of your learners' proficiency they're displaying in their language performances in a way that is meaningful to them, meaningful to you, and relates back to the course objectives and the learning objectives. Another point about evidence, you can have quantitative, which is all to do with measurement again, and numbers and figures, maybe grades, and more qualitative evidence as well, where you're giving more, hopefully not, well, slightly more subjective commentary on what learners are producing. Evidence needs to be aligned with the learning goals, as we've said, and it should be individualized to be really good. Obviously, you need to collect evidence. The next stage is to interpret the evidence as well, so that you can make judgments about the further language development of your students. And the sorts of evidence you could collect test scores, you could collect writing performance or speaking performances, obviously project work or classroom interactions, and there are many different other sorts of evidence that we could think up. So LOA is about collecting evidence. As I mentioned, LOA is also about keeping really structured, accurate records of your learners' development. So records about their performance and their progress. So essentially, you can answer these questions for each of your learners. Where are you? Where do you need to get to? And crucially, how do you get there? Because if you don't know where you're going and you don't know where you currently are, you won't be able to work out the steps you need to take in order to get your learners to that stage. So obviously, we're all busy teachers with a lot of different demands on our time, and sometimes keeping up-to-date records is really challenging. So after this webinar, you could think of, well, what kinds of records do I keep about my learners' progress and performance, and then think about how an LOA approach might help you improve those. The final point about LOA in this section is about the links between learning-oriented assessment and technology. And LOA benefits from technology. It helps teachers to find a use for existing systems they have in their schools or new systems they might want to purchase or use for free. And here are some examples. Technology helps us collect data, so learner performances such as speaking or writing performance, and that gives us both quantitative and qualitative data to collect and analyze. Secondly, technology helps us with record keeping, whether it's looking at classroom data or test data. Obviously, technology helps us to provide feedback that's individualized, targeted, and also technology can help us by providing various support or scaffolding activities at different levels for our students. And technology helps us as well to keep detailed student profiles and class profiles which inform planning and also can feed into the teaching cycle. And finally, there are various ways of automating your scoring and feedback systems so that you can give efficient and perhaps instantaneous feedback to students. It may be that you'll be able to use technology, or you currently use technology, to provide some instantaneous feedback, which might be a score on a test, and then you can follow that up with your own more qualitative commentary on the learner's performance. I'm going to talk in a few slides' time about one particular piece of software that a pair of teachers have already used in an action research project. But as you're probably aware, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different bits of EdTech, educational technology out there that may be useful to you in your classrooms. So just before we end this section looking at LOA in a bit more detail, don't be afraid by this diagram. I'll talk you through it. This slide shows the Cambridge English model of LOA, and this is an example for a class working towards C1 level of the Common European Framework of Reference. We could use any form of framework here, that's fine. And I'll talk you through it from left to right, so there'll be a number of boxes appearing as I talk through the slide. So first of all, in a learning-oriented approach, we start by specifying the learning objectives, which are in box 1. These may be based on an external framework, such as the CFR here. And they might be, you might be putting them together yourself as a teacher, or they might be given to you and you have to use them. So you have a set of learning objectives which are based on a syllabus which is based on a particular framework. And then, if we look at the next box, which will hopefully appear in a second, there we go. In this box here, we have the familiar teaching and learning cycle with teaching and learning happening through various tasks and activities that happen either in class, in the classroom, which you have more control over as a teacher, or out of class. And out of class obviously will be done in various locations, could be on the move, on students' phones, tablets, whatever, laptops, or it could be in a public library or where they're staying. So in a slightly more sort of concrete location. But by doing these tasks and activities, your students are doing activities individually, in pairs or groups that are helping them to meet the learning objectives and are helping them to progress in their learning. So what happens is that obviously there's observation by yourself or by the students through peer assessment of their learning or production. And you're collecting evidence at this stage as well to develop records of achievement for each of your students. And this obviously informs feed forward for students to identify whether they're performing as expected, whether they're weaker in certain areas, or whether they're actually strong and can be moved on to other things. So as I've said, this is the very familiar teaching cycle. And what may happen is that there's a more formal form of assessment that takes place. This could be a classroom-based test, or it could be a more external, higher stakes, more summative assessment, or a standardized test, which is at C1 level to see if the students have reached that level and if they can perform in various real-world contexts. So this is a diagram of the LOA cycle, just to show you how it can work and practice, and the pieces are tied together. Of course, by the time you reach box 3, the assessment, that is not the end of the story, and perhaps this looks like a linear model, which is not. Obviously, depending on how students achieved or not in that assessment, whether it's an external assessment or an internal assessment, it would feed back into either new learning objectives, if they're moving to a different level perhaps, or back into the teaching and learning cycle at stage 2. So that's the end of our close look at LOA in the second section. Let's just look, before I go on to there's one extra slide. This is just to remind you of the Action Research in ELICOS programme focus for this year, for 2016. And these are the areas that you might choose to focus on if you put a proposal in. So it's about linking LOA to curriculum development. It's about using LOA approach in the classroom. You could look at LOA and learner autonomy, which is a very important and key area. Or you could look at LOA and professional development for teachers. So I'm hoping this webinar is giving you a few ideas in at least some of those areas. So let's now look at the last section of my input before there's time for your questions. And in this final section, let's look at how you can put LOA into practice in your classrooms. And I will give you a case study from a previous Action Research project that took place a few years ago in Australia, and it was about the use of technology and the development and assessment of speaking skills. And you can see that Damien and Zeke from Swinburne University in Melbourne led this project. And what they aimed to do was to increase the role of assessment throughout a course where they were focusing on speaking skills, and they wanted to give ongoing feedback that was also systematic. They had 3 assessment events throughout this course, which were participation in a seminar, an interview, and giving presentations. And that's what all of their students had to do. And Damien and Zeke used technology. They used Voicethread. You can see the link there. This is an online platform. And how they used it so that both students and teachers uploaded audio and video. They could listen to each other's responses to the particular tasks, and they could edit each other's content. And you can see below there are 2 cycles, which is typical of an action research approach. You try something out, you see what happens, you sort of interpret the findings, and then you do another cycle, maybe making some changes. And you can see in this particular project, the students had to do 4 speaking assessments. In week 2, they did something about themselves. In week 4, they did something about their studies and integrating into Australian life. And in the second cycle, they did different things. They did an interview with another student, where students uploaded information about other students on their course. And in the final week, they did a practice presentation where they were practicing for speaking test in the final week. The sort of feedback that the teachers that Damien and Zeke were giving were on pronunciation, fluency, the language used, the content, so all normal things to look for. But the way they did it was interesting. They obviously wrote comments. They used audio and video feedback as well through this Voicethread program, and they also gave face-to-face feedback as well. And on the next slide, I just have one example of one of the learners' outcomes, and this was Kit, a postgraduate student from Thailand, and his problem that he wished, or challenge that he wished to improve, was to remove long pauses to increase his fluency. And you can see there was an in-class intervention where all the students had to tell true or false stories, and they had to retell their stories 3 times, trying to halve the time they told it the first time around. And there was also something that Kit had to do outside of class, and he had to re-listen to his recordings and make sure there are no long pauses and re-record where necessary. And you can see the outcomes at the bottom of the slide, whereas in the second week Kit spoke at a rate of 1.01 words per second. Over time that was increased to almost 1.4 words per second, and also he changed the number of words he produced, especially between weeks 2 and weeks 4. I mean, I haven't done the calculation, but I think you can see that there was both a sort of quantitative and a qualitative change in what this particular student achieved. And for example, another student, and I don't have their information on a slide, their particular challenge was to work on specific consonant clusters. But this was an out-of-class intervention, because obviously the particular consonant clusters they were having issues with were individual to them. But this particular student's challenge was a lot less by week 8, having had targeted individual practice. So just a couple of slides to finish off this case study. Just waiting for it to change. There were various challenges and solutions that Damien and Zeke found in their study. And if we think about the teachers first, the teachers found that they had limited ability to give detailed feedback on student-specific problems. So in order to meet this, they looked around existing literature to get ideas and knowledge to improve their ability to give feedback. And for the students to begin with, they were not aware of the meta-language of pronunciation. And so there were various in-class activities to highlight different items and features that identified the meta-language for them. And finally, in this section, I've got a few comments that you can read yourselves. First of all, some of the learner reactions in this particular action research project. So I'll let you read those yourselves, and then I'll move to some teacher reactions. So I think some quite interesting comments there from some of the students from different countries. If we look now at Damien and Zeke's comments as well, I hope that some of those resonate with you and you're beginning to see the benefit of an action research approach and also an LOA approach as well. And just to summarise this particular case study, if we think about how does Damien and Zeke's practice actually support learning, you can see that if their students were using English on a regular basis, they were receiving and giving teacher and peer feedback. They had really frequent, timely, targeted feedback on their particular individual issues. They had technology that was integrated into the learning process from the beginning of this project. And also they helped develop criteria themselves, and there were really explicit standards that the students had to try to reach. And all of this is part of an LOA approach. So just a few summarising slides before it's over to you for any questions you may have. So to summarise, LOA is all about these particular areas. You have the LOA triangle. You have feedback, the learning tasks, and learner involvement. LOA is about really focused, targeted goal setting for all of your learners. It's about using technology as a teacher's aid, not replacing you by any means, but making what you do better. It's about providing systematic feedback that feeds forward into the learning. It is about aligning classroom courses and exam objectives as much as possible. And it's about promoting learner autonomy. Because when your students, if they're teenagers and young adults, if they're about to go into the world, you can do an awful lot for them by promoting their language learning autonomy, which will stand them in good stead. So thinking about who benefits from LOA, well, I believe that LOA has the potential to help multiple groups of people because we collect and interpret evidence about performance so that we can make informed decisions about further language development. And I believe that LOA provides a roadmap for everyone to work towards the same goal. And teachers, they're put back at the heart of assessment, and they can provide clear evidence of their learners' progress towards particular learning objectives. You can think about students who benefit. They receive relevant and timely feedback that feeds forward into their learning, and it helps them to become more independent learners as well. And for the building at the bottom represents the wider society. It's for the schools and the parents and the sponsors of your students who can monitor progress towards targets. And also there's greater accountability and perhaps increasing quality of the learning provided by your language school or centre. It's also that the students of these schools and parents can achieve valid, reliable and recognised certification that will help them in their future lives. So in terms of implementing LOA, there are challenges and there are solutions to how you can go and implement LOA in your classrooms now. Some of the challenges, it does take time and it is quite labour intensive. It involves an aspect of public record keeping, and it does rely on the expertise of the teacher. You have to become a practitioner of LOA, I suppose. But there are solutions to these issues. Obviously, teacher training and development, and that is one of the reasons why the Action Research in LCOS programme exists as a form of great professional development for teachers. A solution as well is about learner autonomy, encouraging your students to do more for themselves and to feed back into the whole teaching, learning, assessment cycle. Technology can certainly help, and I hope I've given you at least one example today of how it can help. And LOA by design, by that, I think all that we're thinking at Cambridge English is that a learning-oriented assessment approach is borne in mind every time you're working on a new set of learning objectives or creating new tasks and activities for your students. So I have a nice little slide, my almost penultimate slide. This is LOA in a nutshell. Essentially, it's about teaching, it's about learning, and it's about assessment, and they all feed into one another. Because assessment tasks, in effect, should be learning tasks, and learning tasks should be assessment tasks. So in every assessment activity, there should be opportunities for learning, and in every learning activity, there should be opportunities for assessment. So a closing thought. What can you do now to integrate different types of assessment? Oops. Aparna, can we go back one slide, please?
No
Thank
problem.
you. Thank you. So I was a bit too keen to finish. Sorry about that, everyone. So these are the sorts of activities that you can do to use an LOA approach. You could think about integrating different types of assessment into your classes. You can think about how to set clearer learning objectives. I'm sure you all set clear ones already. You can think about how you could systematically collect evidence and compile records of your learners' performance. And think about how you could use technology, whether it's new technology or technology that already exists in your centres and you haven't yet been brave enough or known enough to use. And this is where an action research approach is really good for trying things out. And also, how are you going to actively involve your learners in their learning and in their assessment, and how are you going to provide useful feedback that actually feeds forward into their learning? All of these are quite challenging questions, so you don't have to come up with an answer today. But this is where action research means you can look into one of these questions in some detail and get some really interesting, relevant findings. So, my final slide. If you'd like to learn more, there's more information and a couple of videos and a few publications you can read on the Cambridge English website, so cambridgeenglish.org/LOA. And also, every year we have 4 issues of our research notes, which is an online journal. You can get hard copies as well. It's free to everyone. And we have 2 issues per year that focus on action research studies that are done either in the Australian programme or in the UK programme, which started 2 years ago. And so if you want to read more about Damien and Zeke's study that I introduced you to, that's in issue 53. But there are issues, if you go anywhere from issue 44 onwards, you will find a couple of issues per year on action research. So do go and look up those. You should be able to find them quite easily on the Cambridge English website, and the link is there. So that, I think that's the end of my slides. I'm sorry we started a little bit late for you this evening, but I'd like to thank you for listening, and over to you for any questions or comments. I think if they can be more general comments and questions are great, but if you have anything specific, then I can respond to those offline, and I'm sure Aparna will be happy to gather in any questions for me that I can't answer in the time we've got left. So, Aparna, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. That was really comprehensive and a lot of useful information. So if you have questions, could you please type them in and I can relay them to Fiona? So Fiona, one of the questions has to do with the size of the classes. Is it possible to have a learning-oriented approach which is quite specific to individuals given the increasing class sizes? In Australia, we're limited to 18 students per class. But one of the problems we face is the fact that this class dynamic changes constantly with new students enrolling every week. With university, again, the volume is still the question, because though it's still 18, we process huge numbers of students over a period of 1 year, for example. How would learning-oriented assessment apply in those contexts?
Okay, well that's a super question. Thank you for that. And what I can say to begin with is, if you look at some of the previous action research studies that have been written up, quite a number of them are dealing with this whole issue of rolling enrollment, where you may have the same class size, but the students do change over a period of time. It is possible to obviously have a really individualized approach with LOA. And you can certainly, in action research, try something out with one group of students, with another group of students having the standard approach. And it could be 2 groups within the same class, or 2 groups within different classes if you're working with a peer, another teacher who's on an action research project. So there are ways around it. I can't give an exact answer, but there are ways around it. And with an action research project, you don't have to do the same thing with all of the students in your class. You can focus on on a couple. And that's the beauty of the cycles of action research. And quite a lot of the teachers we fund in Australia and in the UK as well, they find exactly this problem. The students they start the course with are not the students they end the course with. But plans change and projects can change, and action research is a very flexible way of working with these sort of changing learner groups. So I hope that gives some encouragement to you to try this approach out.
Thanks, Fiona. We have another question about learner autonomy and learner awareness. So how can learner autonomy be implemented in a classroom when we're guided by strict curriculum?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And again, without knowing more, more detail, I can just answer generally. I think there are certainly some of the action researchers who have looked at learner autonomy before in various ways. So again, I would direct you to have a look at all the studies in research notes. It won't take you long to flick through the contents and find the most relevant ones. But I think with learner autonomy, you can do it in a small way, or you can do it in a much larger way, and it depends on the individual students, the individuals you've got in your organizations. Obviously, if you've got limited time and a really structured curriculum and a particular approach you've got to use and particular course materials, you might think there's no point in taking a more LOA approach and really going hard to get your learners to be more autonomous. But I do believe that even if you can change just one thing, think about maybe what could you change tomorrow as a result of thinking about LOA or learner autonomy. If you make a small change, then I'm sure that other changes would follow. So I hope that's something to think about.
Thank you, Fiona. Just one last question because we're nearly out of time. This is to do with feedback, which according to some of the information you provided today, needs to be instantaneous. Maybe is there any space for delayed feedback versus instantaneous feedback?
I would say yes. I think the point I was trying to get across, it should be timely feedback. If it's possible to give instantaneous feedback and that's the best way of giving it for a particular activity, then do that. But if it should be delayed for a particular reason, that's fine, as long as the students know that that's what's going to happen. I think quite a lot of sort of the other side of learner autonomy, sort of learner acceptance. It's just about accepting things are the way that teacher says they are and not questioning the status quo. And we can understand why that's the case. So I think it's about educating your students as well as educating teachers about the benefits of sort of timely and relevant feedback. And it might be instantaneous, and that's where I think technology can help, and you can get instantaneous or almost instantaneous feedback. But it's all about what's relevant for your context and making sure that you're clear what you're doing and why, and that your students are clear what you're going to do and why as well. Because your students may have other ideas as well. You could ask them, well, how do you want to get feedback? What's going to be the most helpful for you? And there's some very good action research projects that can be done on learner autonomy, on feedback and feed forward as well. So it's great that you're thinking along these lines.
Thanks, Fiona. Just one last comment we had was because there was such great information and so much of it people might need to take some time, revisit and fully absorb before they come back with questions. So that's brilliant. Please do feel free to email your questions to English Australia, and I'm happy to pass them on to Fiona. No pressure to get more questions out there today. I'd really like to thank Fiona for taking the time very early in the morning to do this presentation for us. Fiona, thank you so much, and thank you also for everyone who's attended today's session after a long day of work. So thanks, and please send me those questions when you're ready.
And can I say thank you, Aparna, for organising this, and thank you everyone for attending. And I hope to see some proposals from some of you for the Action Research Programme for 2016. So thank you all.
Thanks, Fiona, and you have a nice day, and it's good night for us.
Okay, good morning from here.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.